Winter, 1875, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Miss Reed, give us the ledger, or this cabin burns, Detective Sterling shouted from the dark woods. Inside, Evie Reed clutched the hidden ledger to her chest, her face pale but her eyes steady. Gideon raised his rifle at the door, while Elias, bleeding from the shoulder, whispered, "Evie, you don't have to face him alone." Evie looked at the two men who had become her only family and said, "I ran 2,000 miles to protect the truth. Today, I stop running." And that was the moment a runaway bride, two wounded men, and one deadly secret turned a lonely mountain cabin into their final stand. The freight car smelled like rust and old hay. Evangeline Reed sat with her back against a crate, knees pulled to her chest, and listened to the wheels grinding beneath her. Somewhere behind them, maybe 10 miles now, maybe 20, the strike was still burning. She could still hear it if she closed her eyes. The shouting, the gunfire that wasn't supposed to happen, Mr. Callahan's voice cracking as he told the workers to stand their ground. Right before the Pinkertons came through the factory gates, like they owned the street. They did own the street in a way. They owned everything except what she carried now. Sewn tight against her own fear, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She held them up in the dark and watched them tremble, and for a moment she almost laughed. 3 years organizing the mill girls of the Lower East Side. 3 years of speeches and secret meetings and midnight ledgers. And here she was, reduced to this, a woman alone in a boxcar, running west with blood under her fingernails that wasn't all her own. She unfolded the bundle in her lap. Wax paper, wrapped twice, tied with butcher's string. Inside it, pages and pages of numbers. Names of foremen who looked away when the machines took fingers. Names of owners who paid off the coroner. When a girl died at her station, rather than lose an hour of production. Names that would end careers, maybe end lives, if they ever reached a newspaper desk. She'd promised Callahan she would get it out. She hadn't promised him she'd survive doing it. The wedding dress was folded beside her. Cheap muslin, the kind sold by the dozen to women desperate enough to marry strangers for a train ticket out of the city. She picked up her needle again. Her fingers were raw, blistered from 3 days without proper food or rest. But she worked the hem open anyway, stitch by stitch, and began tucking the ledger inside the lining. If they searched her bag, they wouldn't find it. If they stripped her trunk apart at some station platform, they wouldn't find it. It would ride against her hip, hidden in plain sight all the way to Montana. The train whistle screamed somewhere ahead, long and mournful, and Evie's whole body went rigid. She waited. No brakes, no slowing. Just night rushing past the slats of the car. Black fields, black sky, nothing to tell her 1 mile of America from another. She thought about the contract folded in her coat pocket. A name she didn't recognize. 2 names, actually. Gideon Hayes and Elias Thorne. Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. A rancher's agent had arranged it through a matrimonial newspaper. No questions asked. Cash paid up front for a bride willing to travel and willing to keep her past to herself. She hadn't asked why 2 men needed 1 wife. She hadn't cared. She needed distance between herself and New York. And distance was the one thing money could still buy her. Her needles slipped and caught her thumb. She hissed, put the wound to her mouth, and kept sewing anyway. Blood on the hem seemed almost fitting. This whole dress was a lie already. Why not let it wear the truth of what it cost her? Outside, the country began to change. She could feel it before she could see it. The way the air coming through the gaps in the boards turned thinner, colder, sharper against her skin. New York had never smelled like this. New York smelled like coal smoke and river mud, and too many bodies packed into too little street. This smelled like nothing at all, which somehow frightened her more. She thought of the girls back at the mill. 60-hour weeks. 12-year-olds losing fingers to machines nobody bothered to guard. She thought of Callahan, and whether he was even alive to know if she made it. She thought of her mother, dead of the same tuberculosis that took half the tenement, and how there had been no ledger, No newspaper story, no justice for her either. That was the whole of it, really. Nobody wrote down what happened to women like them. So Evie had started writing it down herself, one entry at a time, until the entries became a weapon sharp enough to be worth killing over. She finished the last stitch as gray light started to creep through the cracks of the car. Morning, or close to it. She smoothed the hem flat, checked that nothing showed, and folded the dress back into her bag like it nothing more than fabric. Her reflection caught faintly in a metal fitting near the door. Hollow eyes, cracked lips. A woman who looked 10 years older than the 26 she actually was. She almost didn't recognize herself. And then she did, because underneath the exhaustion was the same stubborn set to her jaw that had gotten her thrown out of 3 factories and blacklisted from 2 more. She was still alive. She still had the ledger. She still had a plan. However thin it had become, the train began to slow, wheels screeching against track, steam hissing somewhere up front. Evie gathered her bag, her dress, her nerve, and pressed her palm flat against the wall of the car, like she could steady the whole world through it. Whatever waited for her out there, in that cold and empty country. It couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. She told herself that anyway, and held on to it, all the way to the platform. The train stopped at a platform that barely deserved the name. No station house to speak of, just a plank walkway half buried in old snow. A water tower leaning slightly to one side, and a single lantern swinging from a post in the wind. Evie stepped down onto it, with her carpet bag clutched to her chest, and her breath fogging out in front of her like smoke from a chimney. Cold hit her first. Not the damp cold of New York winters. The kind that crawled up through wet stockings and settled in your bones, slow. This was sharper. It cut. It came down off the mountains behind the platform and went straight through her coat, like the coat wasn't even there. She looked around for someone, anyone, holding a sign or asking after a bride from the east. What she found instead made her stomach drop clean to her boots. 2 men stood near the edge of the platform, and calling them, men felt almost too small a word. The one on the left was broad through the shoulders in a way that seemed built for splitting logs rather than shaking hands. He wore a heavy coat the color of dried mud, a hat pulled low, and a stillness about him that reminded her of men she'd seen come back from the war. The ones who stood in doorways, like they were still waiting for an order. His eyes found her and held there, pale and careful, and giving nothing away. The second man was, if anything, taller, darker hair, darker skin, a face that carried the kind of bones that belonged on a coin. He had a rifle slung easy across his back and a rope in one hand, and beside him stood a horse so large, Evie momentarily forgot to be afraid of the men at all. A Clydesdale. She'd learn later, though in that moment she only knew it as the biggest animal she had ever stood near in her life. Its breath coming out in great white clouds, its hooves the size of dinner plates. And then there was the dog, or what she assumed was a dog, though nothing about its size agreed with that word, gray and thick-coated, with yellow eyes that tracked her, the way a hawk tracks a field mouse. It didn't growl. It didn't move. It just watched. Sitting on its haunches beside the quieter of the 2 men like it, had been carved there. Evie's hand slid into her coat pocket and closed around the small apple paring knife she'd kept hidden since New York. It wasn't much of a weapon. It wasn't much of anything, really, against 2 men that size and an animal built like a wolf. But her hand found it anyway, the way a hand finds a rail on a dark staircase, and she held on. Miss Reed, the taller one, spoke first, and his voice surprised her, low but gentle at the edges. Nothing like the growl she'd braced herself for. Yes, her own voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. She cleared her throat and tried again. Evangeline Reed. Elias Thorne. He nodded once, respectful, the way a man might greet someone he'd known for years rather than seconds. This is Gideon Hayes. Gideon didn't say anything. He looked at her for a long moment, and Evie made herself hold still under it, made herself not look away first. because looking away first was the kind of thing men like Sterling noticed and used. But there was nothing predatory in Gideon's stare. If anything, it looked almost like an apology, like he was sorry for however he appeared to her. Sorry for the size of himself and the silence that came with it. The wind picked up. Evie's teeth had started chattering somewhere around the second minute of standing on that platform, though she'd been trying to hide it. Arms crossed tight, chin up. She'd survived worse than cold. She'd survived men worse than these two, or so she told herself. Gideon moved first. He didn't ask permission. He simply stepped forward, unbuttoned the top clasp of his own coat, and underneath it produced a second coat she hadn't noticed him carrying. A heavy bear fur thing that looked like it weighed more than she did. He held it open, offering, and waited. She hesitated. Every instinct from the last year of her life told her to keep distance between herself and any man built like that, especially one who moved without a sound, despite his size. But the cold had gotten into her fingers by then, into her jaw, and some older, more practical part of her mind reasoned that a man wanting to harm her didn't usually start by keeping her warm. She let him settle the coat over her shoulders. It swallowed her whole. The collar came up past her ears. The hem dropped near her knees. And the warmth of it. God, the warmth of it nearly undid her right there on the platform. She hadn't realized how cold she'd gotten until she wasn't anymore. Her eyes stung, and she blinked hard against it, refusing to let either of these strangers see her cry over a coat. "Thank you," she managed. Gideon only nodded. Up close, she could see what the distance had hidden. 2 fingers missing from his left hand. The skin there long-healed, but still telling its story, plain as words on a page. A scar along his jaw that disappeared into his beard. He caught her looking and didn't flinch from it. Didn't hide the hand behind his back the way some men might. He simply let her see, like there was nothing left in him worth being ashamed of. Elias, meanwhile, had gathered her bag before she'd even thought to protest, slinging it up onto the Clydesdale's back with an ease that made the enormous horse seem almost gentle by comparison. Then he turned to her, and there was something different in his face than in Gideon's. Gideon's stillness felt like a held breath. Elias's calm felt more like a held door, an invitation rather than a wall. "Cabin's a 2-hour ride," he said. "Weather's turning, so we ought to start, may I?" She didn't understand the question until his hands came up, palms open, waiting at her waist. He meant to lift her onto the horse. Evie looked at the animal, then at the drop from the platform to the ground, then back at Elias's open hands. And something in her chest loosened just slightly, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling against it. She nodded. He lifted her like she weighed nothing at all, set her onto the horse's back, with more care than she'd been shown by most men who'd claimed to love her, and then swung up behind her without a word, taking the reins in one hand while keeping the other steady at her side, not touching her more than necessary, just enough to keep her from sliding. Gideon walked alongside, the wolf dog padding at his heel, silent as the man himself. The trail climbed almost immediately, and the world around them turned white and endless. Evie had never seen country like this. New York had rooftops and smokestacks crowding the sky, buildings stacked so tight you forgot there was a horizon at all. Here the horizon went on forever, mountains folding into mountains, snow catching the last gray light of afternoon until the whole valley glowed faint silver. She should have been terrified. In some ways, she still was. The fear sitting low and constant, the same fear that had ridden with her since the massacre outside the mill. But there was something else moving alongside it now, something she didn't have a name for yet. It felt almost like relief, like the first breath after holding one too long. "You're not what I expected," Elias said after a while, his voice carrying easy over the horse's steady rhythm. "What did you expect? Someone smaller, maybe." "The advertisement made you sound delicate." She almost laughed at that. A short, surprised sound that came out before she could stop it. "I've broken up factory fights with less than what you two are hauling around on your belts." Gideon glanced up at that, the first flicker of something like humor crossing his face, gone as quick as it came. "You'll need that grit," Elias said, and there was no mockery in it, only fact. The way a man states weather. This country doesn't forgive softness, but it rewards those willing to work for it. I'm willing, Evie said, and meant it, though she wasn't yet sure what exactly she was agreeing to. They rode in silence after that, the cold biting at her cheeks, the coat holding warm around her shoulders. Somewhere behind her, unseen, unspoken, the ledger rested against her hip, inside the hem of a ruined wedding dress. And she thought of Callahan, and the mill, and all the reasons she'd come this far to hide. She thought, too, of the two men flanking her now. Strangers she'd married on paper, and never once in person. Men whose size had first read to her as threat and now, slowly, strangely, was starting to read as something closer to shelter. The cabin came into view as the light was failing, a low dark shape against a white slope. Smoke already curling from its chimney, though no one had been home to light the fire. Neighbor tends it, Gideon said, catching her confusion. First words he'd spoken since the platform. His voice was rougher than Elias's, lower, carrying the same careful weight as everything else about him. Knew we'd be riding in cold. Evie looked at the cabin, small against that enormous mountain. Warm light glowing faint through a single window, and felt something in her chest ease that had been clenched tight since the night of the strike. She didn't trust it yet. Trust wasn't something she gave easily anymore. Not after New York. Not after watching men she'd believed in turn out to be cowards, or worse. But she let herself. For one moment, imagined that this place might actually be safe. The horse came to a stop in the yard. Elias dismounted first, then reached up for her. And again, she let him lift her down. Let herself be handled with a gentleness she hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet how to accept. Gideon opened the cabin door and stepped back, holding it wide, waiting for her to go first. Evie hesitated on the threshold only a moment, then walked in out of the cold, into the small square of warmth and firelight, and did not look back to see if the two men watched her go. They did. Neither said a word about it. But something in the way they exchanged one brief glance behind her, some silent understanding passing between them, suggested that whatever this arrangement had started as on paper, it had already become something neither of them intended to treat carelessly. The first morning, Evie woke to silence so complete, it startled her more than any noise could have. No street sounds. No factory whistle 3 blocks overcalling girls to their stations before dawn. No carts, no shouting, no distant clang of the elevated train. Just the low crackle of a fire someone had already stoked. And beyond the window, a hush so total, it felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. She lay still a moment longer than she needed to, taking inventory of herself, the way she'd learned to after the strike, checking which parts of her still hurt and which parts had simply gone numb from exhaustion. Her hands ached from the sewing. Her legs ached from 3 days on a train. But she was warm, tucked under more blankets than she remembered pulling over herself, in a small room off the main cabin that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. She found Gideon at the hearth when she came out, feeding the fire, and Elias at the table, cleaning a rifle with the kind of unhurried focus most men reserved for prayer. Neither looked up right away. She appreciated that more than she expected to. In the mill towns, a woman walking into a room full of men learned quick to brace herself for stares. Here, it seemed, a person was simply allowed to exist without being cataloged. "There's coffee," Gideon said, nodding toward a blackened pot on the hearthstone. She poured herself a cup and found it strong enough to strip paint, but she drank it anyway, grateful for the heat of it against her hands. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Elias looked up from the rifle. "You don't need to do anything today. Ride was long. I didn't come out here to sit by a fire while other people work." The words came out sharper than she intended. Old habits from the mill floor where idleness got you fired and softness got you hurt. She saw Elias register the edge in her voice, saw him decide not to push against it. "There's water to haul," Gideon offered instead, watching her carefully, like he was testing how much truth she wanted. "Creek's a 1/4 mile down. Buckets by the door." She took the buckets before Either of them could think twice. The quarter-mile down to the creek was easy enough, all downhill. Her boots crunching through snow, crusted hard enough to hold her weight. The creek itself ran fast even in the cold, black water cutting between ice at its banks, and she knelt to fill the first bucket, feeling almost proud of herself for the simplicity of the task. The walk back up was another matter, entirely. 2 full buckets of water weighed more than she'd accounted for, and the mountain that had seemed a gentle slope walking down turned into something closer to a wall walking up, her boots sliding on packed snow, her arms screaming after the first 100 yards. She stopped twice to set the buckets down and flex feeling back into her fingers. By the time she reached the cabin door, her palms had gone raw where the metal handles had bitten in, 2 blisters already rising angry and red across each hand. She said nothing about it. She set the buckets by the stove, straightened her spine, and went back down for more, because that was what needed doing. And needing doing had always been reason enough for her. By the 4th trip, her hands had started to bleed at the worst of the blisters, thin lines of red mixing with the melting snow on her palms. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. She'd worked 12-hour shifts at a mill loom with fingers numb from cold and machine oil in her lungs. She would not be undone by a bucket of water. It was Elias who noticed first, meeting her at the door on the 5th trip, his eyes going straight to her hands before she could hide them behind her back. "Evie, I'm fine. Let me see." I said, "I'm fine." The words came out harder than she meant, defensive in a way she recognized from 100 conversations with foremen who'd tried to send her home early for being a woman rather than for being hurt. She braced for the same argument now. The same insistence that she couldn't handle the work. The same quiet dismissal that had followed her through every job she'd ever held. It didn't come. Elias simply reached out, gentle as asking, and turned her palms upward into the light. He didn't say anything about weakness. He didn't suggest she rest instead, or leave the hauling to the men, or any of the things she'd braced herself to argue against. "These need tending," he said instead, "or they'll fester before the week's out. Nothing wrong with hard work, tearing up soft hands. Everyone's hands were soft once." He led her inside, sat her by the fire, and from a shelf near the hearth produced a small tin she hadn't noticed before. Something dark and waxy inside that smelled of pine sap and something sweeter underneath. "Bear fat, mostly," he said, working a small amount into her palms with a touch far gentler than his size, suggested he was capable of. "Some herbs I gather in summer. Keeps the skin from splitting." Gideon appeared in the doorway partway through, watched a moment, said nothing, and disappeared back outside. When Evie finished her coffee an hour later and went looking for the water buckets to finish her chore, she found them already full, sitting steaming faintly by the stove, hauled without a word, while she'd been sitting with her hands in Elias's care. She didn't know what to do with that. In New York, help had almost always come with a price, a favor owed, a debt collected later in ways that cost more than the help had been worth. She waited for the demand here too, some quiet expectation she'd be asked to repay. It never came. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself in small, unremarkable ways. She'd wake to find the fire already stoked before her hands even remembered how cold mornings could be. She'd reach for the axe to split kindling and find Gideon there instead, wordlessly taking over, leaving her the lighter work of stacking what he'd already cut. She tried, more than once, to insist she could manage, that she hadn't traveled 2,000 miles to be treated like glass. "Not glass," Gideon said once, the most words she'd heard from him strung together at one time. "Iron takes longer to shape. Don't mean it can't be shaped." She thought about that sentence longer than she probably should have. By the end of the first week, her hands had begun to heal, calluses forming where blisters had split, the bare fat salve appearing fresh by her pillow each night, without either man ever mentioning it directly. She noticed, too, the small ways the cabin had begun to shift around her presence. A second chair pulled closer to the fire, her boots set to dry by the hearth without being asked. A rough-carved comb left on the shelf near her bed, its teeth smoothed and even, clearly made by hand. She held that comb the first night she found it, turning it over in her fingers, thinking of the Union men back home who'd talked endlessly about solidarity and brotherhood while doing precious little of either in practice. These two men, strangers to her a week before, had said almost nothing about partnership. They had simply shown her what it looked like, one small unasked for kindness at a time. It didn't erase her fear. She still slept, some nights, with the paring knife under her pillow, still flinched at sudden sounds outside the cabin walls, still carried the weight of the ledger, and everything it meant tucked tight against her ribs. But the fear had started sharing space with something else, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long while. She caught herself, one evening, watching Gideon repair a broken chair leg by firelight, his ruined hand moving with a patience that belied its missing fingers. And she thought, not for the first time, that survival out here didn't look anything like she'd expected. It didn't look like brute force or hard bargains. It looked like small, repeated acts of care, offered without condition, by two men the world had likely never once offered the same kindness to. She didn't say any of this aloud, but she started leaving her own small offerings in return. A shirt mended where the men hadn't noticed the tear. A meal cooked with whatever skills she had left over from a childhood before the mills. Small currencies in a language none of them had needed words to teach her. The blizzard came at the end of the second week, the kind of storm that turned the world outside the cabin windows into a solid wall of white. Wind screaming around the corners of the roof like something alive and furious. Gideon had brought in extra wood the day before. Some instinct in him, reading the sky, before the sky had made its intentions plain. And by the time the storm broke fully, they were sealed in tight. 3 people and 1 enormous dog in a space that suddenly felt smaller than it had all week. Evie didn't mind the confinement. If anything, she found a strange comfort in it. The fire roaring, the wind unable to reach them. The 3 of them settling into an easy rhythm of small talk and shared silence that had slowly become familiar. It was the second night of the storm when everything changed. She woke first to the sound of Gideon's voice, low and ragged, saying words that made no sense strung together, half-formed names and half-formed orders. The kind of talk she recognized from something worse than a nightmare. She sat up in the dark, heart hammering, and heard Elias's voice next, calm but urgent, saying Gideon's name over and over like an anchor thrown into rough water. She came out of her room to find them on the floor near the hearth. The fire burned low, and Gideon thrashing against something only he could see. His hands locked around Elias's forearms with a grip that looked like it could snap bone. Elias wasn't fighting back. He knelt there and took it, absorbing the worst of Gideon's panic without once raising a hand against him. His own voice steady, even as his knuckles went white from the pressure. Gideon, it's Elias. You're home. You're safe. Gideon's eyes were open, but seeing something else entirely. Some field or trench or moment that had never fully released its hold on him, years after whatever war had put it there. His breath came in short, tearing gasps, and his hands only tightened further, dragging Elias closer instead of pushing him away. Some part of his mind mistaking the man beside him for a threat that needed containing. Evie's first instinct was to run. Every part of her. Every year of learning which situations to flee and which to fight told her this was a moment to make herself small and stay out of the way. She had seen men break like this before, back east, veterans of the same war who'd come home wrong, in ways the newspapers never wrote honestly about. And she knew how badly it could go for anyone caught too close. She stayed anyway. She stepped forward slowly, kneeling on Gideon's other side, close enough that his flailing arm brushed her shoulder before she caught it, gentle, and held it still against her own chest. Elias's eyes flicked to her, a warning in them, but she shook her head once, steady, and kept her voice low, and even when she spoke, Gideon, look at me. His eyes found her, though whether he truly saw her yet, she couldn't say. She kept talking anyway, the same low, unhurried tone she'd once used to calm mill girls after machine accidents. The tone that mattered more than the words themselves. You're not there anymore. You're here. You're safe. I've got you. She drew his head against her chest the way she might have once comforted a child, one hand cradling the back of his skull, and began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby in the traditional sense. It was an old Union song, one she'd learned standing on picket lines in the cold, its melody simple and repetitive, meant to keep exhausted workers moving through long nights of protest. She'd never imagined singing it to soothe rather than to rally. But the rhythm of it seemed to work regardless of its original purpose. Something in the steady, familiar cadence reaching past whatever storm was raging behind Gideon's eyes. Slowly, his breathing began to even out. His grip on Elias's arms loosened, then released entirely. His body, tense as drawn wire only minutes before, began to sag. Exhaustion finally winning out over whatever memory had gripped him. By the time the song ended, he was simply a man again, spent and shaking faintly, his face pressed against her shoulder. Ashamed in the particular way strong men often were after losing control of themselves in front of others. "I'm sorry," he said, voice hoarse, not looking at either of them. "I could have hurt you both." "You didn't," Elias said, flexing feeling back into his own bruised forearms without a hint of resentment in his voice. "I could have, but you didn't," Evie repeated, firmer this time, still holding him steady. "That's what matters." Gideon was quiet a long moment, the fire popping softly in the silence, wind still howling outside the walls. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the roughness of panic and gained instead a kind of weary honesty she suspected he rarely offered anyone. 2 fingers. He held up his damaged hand between them, firelight catching the old scarring. "Lost them to frostbite the same winter. I lost most of what I used to be. Sharpshooter, they called me. Good at killing men from far enough away, I never had to see their faces up close. Except sometimes I did see them. Still do, some nights." Elias settled back against the hearth, listening without interrupting, and Evie realized this was likely something the 2 men had discussed before, in pieces, over years of living side by side. But perhaps never quite so plainly, and certainly never in front of anyone else. "I don't sleep easy most nights," Gideon continued. "Elias knows to keep his distance when the wind gets loud like tonight. Storms bring it back worse. I don't know why. You don't have to explain yourself to me," Evie said quietly. "I want to." He looked at her directly then, something raw and unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen from him before. "You could have run just now. Most would have. I've seen broken men before," she said. "Watched half the strikers I organized with come home from that same war, changed in ways nobody had names for yet. I learned a long time ago that broken doesn't mean dangerous. It just means hurting." Elias spoke then, his own voice carrying a different kind of weight, quieter, more careful, the tone of a man circling toward a confession of his own. "I understand something of that too," he said. "Different kind of hurt. Folks in town look at me and decide who I am before I've said a single word. Half white, half Shoshone, and neither half ever seems to count as enough for anybody. I learned young to hold myself very still around people, because stillness read as harmless, and harmless kept me breathing some nights." Evie looked between the 2 of them. This sniper haunted by a war that refused to end, and this tracker exhausted by a world that refused to see him whole. And something settled in her that had nothing to do with fear at all. "I'm not so different," she said finally. "I've spent years being told a woman's voice doesn't belong in rooms where decisions get made, told to smile prettier, speak softer, stop asking so many questions. I learned to fight anyway, because staying quiet never once kept me safe, only made me smaller." The fire cracked low between them. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the small warmth building, inside 4 wooden walls. "3 broken things," Elias said eventually, something almost like a smile in his voice. "Might be we fit together better than whole ones would." Gideon huffed something close to a laugh, still leaning tired against Evie's shoulder, in no hurry to move away. "Might be," he agreed. Evie didn't have an answer for that yet, not one she trusted enough to say aloud. But she stayed where she was through the rest of that long, howling night, one hand still resting against Gideon's back, the other near enough to Elias that he could reach it if he needed to. And, for the first time since the massacre outside the mill, she let herself believe that safety might not be something she had to fight alone to find. By morning, the storm had softened to a gentle, steady snow, and the three of them woke tangled together near the dying fire. None of them quite ready yet to name what had shifted between them, but none of them willing, either, to pull away. By the time the supplies ran low, 3 weeks had passed since the storm that changed everything between them. Though none of the three had spoken the change aloud, Evie noticed it in small things. The way Gideon no longer stood at a careful distance when he handed her a cup of coffee. The way Elias had started teaching her to read tracks in the snow, patient as a schoolteacher, his hand occasionally resting over hers to guide her fingers along a print in the frost. Nothing had been said outright, but something had settled between the three of them regardless. Something warmer than the arrangement they'd started with. "We'll need flour, salt, coffee," Gideon said one morning, checking the shelves with the flat tone of a man accustomed to counting supplies down to the ounce. "And you'll want proper boots before spring thaw. I can manage with what I have. You can't," Elias said, not unkindly. "Your boots have more hole than leather left in them. Town trip's overdue regardless." She hadn't left the mountains since arriving, and some part of her had grown almost comfortable with that. The isolation, acting as a kind of shield against the world she'd fled. But she understood the practical need well enough, and she'd never once been the sort of woman who hid from necessary discomfort. "All right," she said, "town it is." The ride down took most of the morning. The trail easier, now that the worst of winter had passed its peak, though snow still lay heavy in the shadowed places between ridges. Evie rode the Clydesdale again, Elias walking alongside this time, Gideon a step behind with the rifle slung easy across his back, and Goliath trotting a wide loop around all three of them, like he was herding something, only he could sense. The town, when it finally appeared below them, wasn't much more than a single main street lined with a handful of buildings. A livery, a saloon, a church with a leaning steeple, and general store with a faded sign reading Whitfield's Mercantile. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. A handful of townsfolk moved between buildings, bundled thick against the cold, and more than one of them turned to stare openly as the three of them rode in. Evie felt the weight of those stares immediately. Not the curious sort of look a stranger might draw in any small town. Something sharper. Several eyes lingered longest on Elias, narrowing in a way she recognized instantly from the mill towns back east. The same look reserved for immigrants and freedmen, and anyone else deemed less than by virtue of birth rather than character. Elias didn't react outwardly. His shoulders stayed loose, his pace steady, though Evie noticed the subtle way he angled his path to avoid walking too close to a group of men gathered outside the saloon. A habit, clearly, practiced over years of learning exactly how much space to leave between himself and trouble. They tied the horse outside the mercantile and stepped in out of the cold, a bell above the door jangling their arrival. The shop smelled of tobacco, oiled leather, and dried beans. Shelves crowded with goods, stacked floor to ceiling. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with thinning hair and small, hard eyes, who looked up at their entrance with an expression that soured the moment it landed on Elias. "We don't serve his kind here," the man said, before any of them had said a word of greeting. "Told him that plain enough last time he came through. We need supplies," Gideon said, his voice level, though Evie caught the tension gathering in his jaw. "He can wait outside. You and the lady can shop fine." Elias's expression didn't change, though something in his posture straightened, a man bracing for weather he'd weathered too many times before to be surprised by it any longer. "I'll wait out front," he said quietly, already turning toward the door. "You will not." Evie's voice cut across the shop before she'd fully decided to speak, sharp and clear in a way that seemed to surprise even her. Every eye in the store swung toward her. "We came here together. We'll shop here together." The shopkeeper's face reddened. Now see here, Mrs. I don't know what kind of arrangement you've got with these two, and frankly, I don't care to know. But I run a respectable establishment, and I won't have what? Evie stepped forward, setting her small purse of coins down on the counter with a deliberate click. Every dollar in it represented weeks of careful economy, money she could scarce afford to spend on anything but necessity. She didn't hesitate. Won't have a paying customer. Won't have honest coin spent in your store. It ain't about the coin. Then what exactly is it about? She held his gaze steady. The same look she'd used 100 times facing down factory foremen twice her size back east. Men who'd expected her to wilt, and instead found something considerably harder waiting for them. Because from where I stand, all I see is a man who works harder than most anyone I've met, treated poorly for nothing more than the family he was born into. That's not respectability. That's cowardice wearing a clean apron. A murmur passed through the handful of other customers in the store. Some uncomfortable, a few almost approving, though none brave enough to voice it outright. I'll take what we came for, Evie continued, sliding her coins fully across the counter now, and you'll hand every last item directly to Mr. Thorne here, since he's the one who'll be carrying it home regardless. A man's dignity is never measured by the color of his skin, but by how he treats those he deems beneath him. And right now, sir, you're teaching this whole room exactly what kind of man you are. Shopkeeper's jaw worked silently for a long moment, caught between pride and the plain fact of coin sitting untouched on his counter. Finally, grudgingly, he began gathering their order, sliding each item across to Elias without meeting his eyes, though he no longer refused to hand it over. Elias caught Evie's gaze as he accepted the first sack of flour, something unreadable passing across his face. Gratitude tangled up with a discomfort she suspected came from rarely, if ever, having someone stand so plainly in his corner. You didn't need to do that, he said quietly, once they were back outside. Supplies loaded onto the horse. I know I didn't need to. Could have made trouble for you. Word travels fast in towns this small. Let it travel. Evie tied the last sack tight against the saddle, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still humming under her skin. I spent 3 years telling factory owners exactly what I thought of how they treated the people beneath them. I'm not about to go quiet now over a shopkeeper with a mercantile and a small man's notion of respectability. Gideon, who had said little through the entire exchange, watched her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something that looked almost like pride settling into the careful lines of his face. They were nearly finished, loading the last of the supplies, when a man stepped out from the shadow of the livery across the street, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being watched and unbothered by it. He wore a dark coat, well-tailored despite the dust of travel, and a badge of sorts pinned discreetly beneath the lapel. The kind Evie recognized instantly from a dozen strike-breaking crews back home. Pinkerton. She kept her face carefully blank, focusing on the strap in her hands, though every nerve in her body had gone taut as wire. Fine display back there, the man said, addressing no one in particular, though his eyes had settled squarely on Evie. Not often you see a woman speak so plain in a room full of strangers. Takes a certain kind of confidence, or a certain kind of history. Just tired of poor manners, Evie said, keeping her voice light, disinterested. The same casual tone she'd perfected while dodging factory detectives back east. The man's eyes lingered a moment longer than comfort allowed, cataloging her face with the careful attention of someone matching features against a memory, or perhaps a photograph tucked inside a coat pocket. Detective Sterling. Pleasure, I'm sure, Evie said, and turned back to the horse, hands trembling faintly where no one could see them. Sterling didn't press further, merely tipped his hat and continued on his way down the street, unhurried, watching. But Evie felt his attention long after he'd disappeared from sight. The same cold certainty she'd felt the night of the strike settling low in her stomach. You know him, Gideon said quietly. Once they were well clear of town and climbing back toward the mountain. It wasn't a question. I know his kind, Evie said, which was true enough, though not the whole truth. Not yet. Elias glanced at her, then at Gideon. Some silent understanding passing between the two men that Evie couldn't quite read. Neither pressed her further, but she noticed, for the rest of the ride home, that both men kept a closer watch on the trail behind them than they had on the way down, and neither commented on it, and neither needed to. The blizzard arrived 2 days after their trip to town, dropping down off the peaks, with a suddenness that left even Gideon scrambling to secure the last of the livestock before the worst of it hit. By nightfall, the wind had turned into something with teeth, snow driving sideways past the windows, the whole cabin groaning under the weight of the storm outside. Evie found herself grateful for it, despite the discomfort of confinement, some instinctive part of her recognizing that a storm this fierce would keep Sterling and anyone riding with him pinned wherever they'd taken shelter. Whatever trail led back to her would have to wait until the weather broke. But confinement bred its own kind of danger. 3 people locked inside 4 walls for days on end, with nothing to do but sit close by the fire and talk, tended to wear thin, whatever polite distance still remained between them. It was the 3rd night of the storm, when the walls finally came down entirely. "You've been jumping at shadows since town," Gideon said, watching her from across the fire, his voice gentle but unwilling to let the observation pass unspoken any longer. "Something's troubling you." Evie's hands stilled over the shirt she'd been mending. Needle paused mid-stitch. She'd known this conversation was coming eventually, had rehearsed a dozen versions of it in her mind over the past weeks, weighing how much truth these 2 men had earned and how much danger that truth might bring down on them if she spoke it aloud. But she was tired of carrying the weight of it alone, tired of watching every shadow for a threat she'd never fully explained to the 2 people who'd shown her more decency than most anyone else in her life. "I'm not who you think I am," she said finally, setting the mending aside. "Or rather, I am, but there's more to it than what the marriage advertisement told you." Elias set down the harness leather he'd been repairing, giving her his full attention. Patient as always, waiting rather than pressing. "My name is Evangeline Reed. That much is true. But before I came out here, I organized textile workers in New York. 3 years of it. Meetings and marches and midnight strategy sessions, trying to force better wages and safer conditions out of men who'd sooner see us all dead than pay us fairly." She told them everything then. The strike that had turned violent, the massacre outside the mill, men and women shot down in the street by hired Pinkertons, protecting nothing but profit. The ledger she'd carried out, hidden now inside the hem of the wedding dress folded at the bottom of her trunk. Proof enough to end careers and possibly send men to prison. Proof valuable enough that someone had put a bounty on the head of the woman who carried it. "That detective in town," she continued, voice steady despite the tremor she felt building underneath it. "He wasn't there by accident. Men like that don't wander into towns this remote without reason. He's looking for me. And if he finds me, he won't stop at just retrieving the ledger." Silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the storm still howling outside. "You should have told us sooner," Gideon said, though there was no anger in it, only a kind of weary concern. "I was afraid." The admission cost her more than she expected. "Afraid you'd see me as a liability. Afraid you'd want nothing more to do with a woman who's brought danger straight to your door." "I should leave," she continued, forcing the words out before either of them could interrupt. "Come morning, once the storm breaks. I'll take what I can carry and go. You didn't sign on for this kind of trouble, and I won't have either of you paying the price for choices I made long before I ever met you." "No." The word came from both of them at once, firm enough that Evie startled slightly at the force of it. "You're not going anywhere," Elias said, moving to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his own with a gentleness that belied the certainty in his voice. "Whatever danger follows you, we face it together. That's what family does." "Family," Evie repeated, testing the word. "That's what you've become to us," Gideon said, moving to sit beside her now. close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against hers. Weeks back, I'd have called this arrangement a practical one. Two men needing help running a homestead, a woman needing distance from wherever she'd come from. But it stopped being practical a good while ago. When did it stop? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. The night of the storm, Gideon said. When you stayed, instead of running? When you sang to me like I was still worth saving? Or before that? Elias added, thumb tracing gentle circles against the back of her hand. When you fought for me in that mercantile, without a second thought for your own safety. Evie looked between the two of them, firelight catching the honesty plain on both their faces, and felt the last of her careful defenses finally give way entirely. I love you, she said, the words coming out simple and unguarded, stripped of the careful strategy she'd built her whole adult life around. Both of you. I didn't come out here looking for this. I came out here running from everything I'd lost back east. But somewhere along the way, I stopped running, and I don't want to run anymore. Then don't, Gideon said, cupping her face gently in his good hand, the scarred one resting careful at her waist. Stay. Fight beside us if trouble comes, but don't leave. I love you too, Elias said, quiet and certain, pressing a kiss to the raw, healing skin of her palm, the same hand he'd tended weeks before with bare fat and patience. Have for longer than I likely should admit. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, something far gentler had finally settled into place. Three broken people finding in each other exactly the steadiness none of them had known they were missing. They stayed like that a long while, close by the fire, saying little more, needing little more said. Whatever came with morning, whatever Sterling might bring riding up that mountain once the snow cleared. They would face it now as something whole rather than three separate, isolated fears. For the first time since the massacre outside the mill, Evie let herself believe entirely in the possibility of safety, not as an absence of danger, but as the presence of people willing to stand beside her against it. The fire had burned low by the time the conversation quieted into something else entirely. The three of them still tangled together on the rug before the hearth. The storm outside now more of a low hum than a scream. Evie sat between them, Gideon's arm loose around her shoulders, Elias's hand still resting warm over hers. And something had shifted in the air. A tension that had nothing to do with fear. She felt it building slow, the way heat builds before a storm finally breaks. Gideon's fingers traced idle patterns along her arm, and Elias's thumb had stilled against her palm. Both men watching her now, with a kind of careful, restrained attention that made her breath come quicker. Evie, Gideon's voice had dropped low, rough at the edges. Tell us to stop, and we will. Right now, or any moment after. Say the word. She understood what he was offering, and asking, both at once. Understood, too, that made such a question necessary for her specifically. Her body had rarely, in her adult life, belonged fully to her own choosing. Factory owners had claimed her labor. Strikebreakers had claimed her safety. Even the marriage contract that brought her here had, on paper, claimed something of her future before she'd ever met the men now waiting patient beside her. But this moment, this choice, was entirely hers. I don't want you to stop, she said, and meant it fully. What followed unfolded slow, deliberate, neither man rushing toward anything she hadn't clearly welcomed first. Elias's mouth found hers gentle, testing, and she leaned into it fully, some old caution finally loosening its grip. Gideon's hand traced careful along her side, waiting for her lead rather than taking it. And she found herself grateful all over again for the patience both men had shown her since the moment she'd stepped off that train. They moved to the bedroom eventually, firelight following them in flickering shadows across the walls. And for a while, the world narrowed down to warmth and closeness and the slow unlearning of every guard she'd built around herself over years of survival. But when both men finally stood before her, fully revealed, the sheer size and presence of them together struck her all at once, overwhelming in a way she hadn't fully braced for. A year of fear, of controlled bodies and controlled choices, rose up unexpectedly against the intensity of the moment, and her breath caught somewhere between wanting and panic. "Stop," she gasped, pulling back slightly, one hand coming up instinctively between them. "It's too big. All of this. I need a moment." Everything stopped instantly. Gideon's hands went still at his sides. Elias eased back without hesitation, giving her space immediately, neither man showing the slightest trace of frustration or impatience. "Take whatever time you need," Elias said softly. "We're not going anywhere." "I'm sorry," Evie managed, embarrassed at the sudden rush of vulnerability, angry at herself for the fear still living somewhere beneath her skin, despite everything these two men had shown her. "Don't apologize," Gideon said, voice gentle, moving no closer than the distance she'd already set. "Your body's yours to command. Always has been. Always will be. Long as you're under this roof." He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. And when she didn't, he cupped her face with a tenderness that felt almost like worship, his thumb tracing soft along her cheekbone. Elias, meanwhile, lifted her hand gently, pressing his mouth to the calluses and healing scars across her palm, the same hand he'd tended with bare fat weeks before, honoring the labor and hardship written plain across her skin. "We don't bite," Gideon murmured, something almost like humor threading through the gentleness of his tone. "Not unless invited to, and even then, only ever gentle." Something in Evie loosened at that, the last hard knot of fear finally giving way to something warmer. She laughed, unexpected and a little shaky, and the sound of it seemed to ease the tension in the room entirely. "I'm ready," she said, steadier now. "I want this. I want both of you." What followed was slow and unhurried, built entirely around her comfort, rather than either man's own urgency. Every touch came with a question first, spoken or otherwise, and every answer she gave was honored fully before either man moved further. There was no demand in it, no expectation, only patient attention and quiet reverence. The same steady care both men had shown her since the day she arrived, now simply expressed in a different language. By the time morning light finally broke pale through the frosted window, the storm outside had passed entirely, leaving behind a hushed, snow-bright world. Evie lay warm between the two men who had somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, become the truest home she had ever known, and she thought, drifting towards sleep, that safety had never once looked the way she'd expected it to. It didn't look like walls or weapons or distance kept carefully between herself and danger. It looked like this: patience, attention. Two men large enough to frighten most anyone who met them, and gentle enough to earn, fully and honestly, the trust of a woman who had spent years believing gentleness and strength could never belong to the same hands at once. She had been wrong about that, she realized, settling deeper into the warmth beside her. Wrong, and gladly so. The peace lasted 11 days. Evie counted them without meaning to. The way a person counts anything they know is borrowed time. 11 mornings waking warm between two men who'd become her whole world. 11 days of chores and small talk and the easy, unhurried rhythm of a life she hadn't let herself believe she deserved. She should have known better than to trust it. It was Goliath who caught the warning first, a low growl building in his chest at something none of the humans could yet see or hear, his hackles rising along his spine as he stood at the edge of the porch, nose pointed down the mountain trail. Gideon was at the window within seconds, rifle already in hand, some old soldier's instinct pulling him upright before his mind had fully caught up to the danger. "Riders," he said. 6, maybe 7. Coming up slow. Elias joined him at the window, and Evie watched both men go still in a way she recognized now. The same careful stillness she'd first mistaken for menace back on that train platform, weeks and a lifetime ago. "Sterling," she said, though she didn't need to ask. She'd known this day would come eventually, had simply hoped for more time before it did. "Get the ledger," Gideon said, not unkindly, already moving to bar the door, "and stay clear of the windows." She did as told, retrieving the wax-wrapped bundle from where she'd hidden it these past weeks. tucked now inside a loose floorboard beneath her bed rather than the ruined dress it had traveled in. Her hands didn't shake as much as she expected them to. Months of fear had a way of hardening into something closer to readiness, given enough time. By the time she returned to the main room, Elias had already taken position near the second window, rifle steady, his tracker's eyes scanning the tree line with a patience that belied the tension coiled tight beneath his calm exterior. "They've stopped at the tree line," he said, setting up cover. A voice carried up from below moments later, amplified by cupped hands, cutting clear through the cold morning air. "Miss Reed, Detective Sterling, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I've a warrant here for your arrest on charges of grand theft and incitement to riot. Come out peaceful. Hand over what you're carrying, and no harm needs to come to anyone up there." "He's lying," Evie said quietly. "There's no warrant. There never was. This is about the ledger. Nothing more." "We know," Gideon said, already checking the rifle's chamber with the same unhurried competence he brought to every task. The morning passed in a tense standoff, Sterling's men visible occasionally between the trees, shifting position with the careful patience of men accustomed to sieges rather than open combat. By midday, the situation had clarified itself in ways none of them wanted. "They've cut the creek," Elias reported, returning from a careful scout along the cabin's rear wall. "Dammed up the water where it feeds down from the ridge. We've got what's in the barrel. Maybe 2 days' worth if we're careful. They mean to starve us out," Gideon said, "or force our hand before we're ready to make it." "There's still the well," Evie offered, though she already suspected the answer. "Froze solid 2 winters back," Gideon said. "Never got around to fixing it. Creek's always been enough. Until now." The day dragged on in tense increments, the three of them rationing movement as carefully as they now had to ration water, watching the tree line for any sign of advance, listening for any change in the wind that might carry sound of the men waiting below. It was near dusk when the first real threat arrived, not in the form of gunfire, but smoke, thin at first, then thickening along the western tree line, where dry timber stood close enough to the cabin to matter. "They're going to burn us out," Elias said, watching the smoke build with the flat calm of a man who'd faced fire before and understood exactly how quickly it could turn deadly in country, this dry despite the snow. "Let them try," Gideon said, though his jaw had tightened considerably. The fire never fully took hold, the damp snow still thick enough on the ground to slow its spread. But the message had been sent clearly enough. Sterling meant business, and he meant to see this through to whatever end suited him best. Full dark had settled by the time the real trouble started. Goliath broke from the porch without warning, charging toward the tree line with a fury Evie had never seen from the animal before. Some deputy having crept too close under cover of darkness, testing the cabin's defenses. Gunfire cracked once, twice, and Evie's heart lurched as she watched the wolf dog stumble, catching himself, still charging forward, despite whatever damage the shot had done. Goliath. Elias was already moving before she'd fully processed what was happening, throwing the door open and diving off the porch directly into the line of fire, putting himself bodily between the dog and whatever deputy had fired that shot. The world seemed to slow for one long, terrible second. Elias reached the wounded animal and dragged him bodily back toward the cabin's cover. And just as they cleared the worst of the exposed ground, another shot cracked through the darkness, and Elias staggered, a sound tearing from his throat that Evie would remember for the rest of her life. Elias. She was moving before Gideon could stop her, hauling the door wider, helping drag both man and dog inside as Gideon laid down, covering fire from the window above, his rifle cracking in steady, practiced rhythm. "I'm fine," Elias gritted out, though the blood spreading fast across his shoulder told a different story entirely. "You are not fine." Evie's hands were already at his shirt, tearing it open to assess the damage. Years of tending injured strikers, giving her steady hands despite the fear roaring through her chest. The bullet had caught him high in the shoulder, missing anything vital by what looked like pure luck. but bleeding heavily regardless. Pressure, she said, more to herself than either of them, grabbing a folded shirt from the nearby shelf and pressing it hard against the wound. Gideon, I need whiskey, and whatever's left of that salve. Gideon abandoned his position at the window, only long enough to retrieve both, his hands steady despite the tightness in his face, and returned immediately to covering the window, rifle ready. Elias hissed as she cleaned the wound, but held still, his good hand coming up to rest gentle against her arm. Some instinct to comfort her, even through his own pain. Goliath, he managed, glancing toward the dog now whimpering low near the hearth, a graze along his flank bleeding, but nowhere near as serious as Elias's own wound. He'll live, Evie said, finishing the makeshift bandage as best she could manage in the dim firelight, because you made sure of it. Couldn't let them shoot him for guarding a porch that isn't even his fight. It is his fight, Gideon said from the window, not turning from his watch. Same as it's ours, same as it's hers. Outside, the shouting had resumed, Sterling's voice carrying up the mountain again, this time laced with impatience. You're only delaying things. Miss Reed, come morning, we burn the whole mountain if that's what it takes. Evie finished tying off Elias's bandage and sat back, her hands stained red, her heart hammering with a fury she hadn't let herself fully feel until now. He's not getting this ledger, she said, quiet but absolutely certain. Not while I'm still breathing. None of us plan on that changing anytime soon, Gideon said, finally glancing back at her, something fierce and protective burning behind his careful calm. Elias, propped against the wall, wounded but steady, met her eyes with the same certainty. Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together, same as always. Evie nodded, gathering herself, letting the fear settle into something harder and more useful. She'd survived a massacre once already. She'd carried a ledger 2,000 miles to protect the truth it held. She would not let it end here, not with Sterling smoke still curling faint against the tree line, not with two men bleeding and fighting for a life she'd only just learned to want fully. The night stretched on, tense and watchful, the cabin holding its small, stubborn line against the darkness gathering outside. Dawn broke gray and cold, the kind of light that offered no comfort, only clarity. Evie hadn't slept, hadn't even tried, spending the night instead, tending Elias's wound and reloading whatever ammunition they had left, while Gideon kept steady watch at the window. They'll move at first light, Gideon said, voice low, calculating. Sterling's not a patient man. He'll want this finished before more attention gathers. How many men left him after last night? Evie asked. 4, maybe 5, Elias said, sitting up despite his wound, refusing to be sidelined from what was coming. Lost one clean to Goliath's charge before he ever got that shot off. Bought us that much. At least, Gideon nodded once, already moving toward the loft ladder. I'll take the high ground. Better line on the tree cover from up there. I can still track, Elias said, wincing as he stood, testing the strength of his wounded arm. You'll bleed out before you make it 20 yards, Evie said firmly. I've bled worse and walked further. His jaw set, stubborn in a way that reminded her of every hard-headed striker she'd ever tried to talk sense into back home. There's a trench along the snow line, cut deep enough to move through unseen if a man knows where to look. I know where to look, Evie wanted to argue further, but she recognized, too, the particular stubbornness of a man who needed to fight for what mattered to him. Needed it the way she'd once needed to fight for the mill girls back home, despite every danger it brought her. She'd learned better than to stand fully in the way of that kind of need. Then go, she said instead. But come back to me, both of you. Gideon paused at the ladder long enough to press a hard, brief kiss to her forehead. Count on it. The battle began in earnest as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, gunfire cracking sharp through the cold air. Gideon's shots came steady and precise from the loft window, each one finding its mark with the same deadly accuracy that had once made him a feared sniper in a war he still carried nightmares from. One by one, Sterling's cover positions along the tree line fell silent, deputies scrambling for new ground as their numbers thinned. Elias moved low and unseen through the trench he'd described. His tracker's knowledge of the terrain, letting him flank the remaining deputies from an angle none of them expected. Evie heard the scuffle, more than saw it. A startled shout cut short, and understood without needing confirmation that Elias had taken down another of Sterling's men in close combat, despite his wounded shoulder. Inside the cabin, Evie kept watch through the rear window, rifle in hand, though her aim had never been half so practiced as either of her men's. Still, she understood well enough that a weapon in steady hands mattered more than perfect skill, particularly when desperation started narrowing an enemy's options. It was in that narrowing desperation that Sterling made his move. She heard the back door splinter before she saw him, and turned just in time to catch a fist closing hard around her hair, wrenching her backward with enough force to buckle her knees. The cold press of a revolver barrel found her ribs a half-second later, Sterling's breath hot and furious against her ear. "Enough of this," he snarled. "Hand over the ledger, or I put a bullet through you right here and take it off your corpse." Evie's mind raced, though her body had gone eerily calm. The same calm she remembered from the night of the strike. The calm that came when fear finally burned itself down into pure, focused clarity. She would not wait for Gideon or Elias to save her. She had never once, in her whole life, waited passively for anyone else to determine her fate, and she would not start now. Not with everything she'd fought for hanging in the balance. Her hand slid slow and careful toward her sleeve, where the small apple paring knife had ridden hidden since the day she'd fled New York. The same knife she'd carried through every uncertain mile of her journey west. Sterling focused on the ledger, on his own fury. Didn't notice the movement until it was far too late. She drove the blade hard and sure into the meat of his thigh, twisting as she pulled it free, and his grip on her hair released instantly as pain tore a scream from his throat. She stumbled forward, out of his reach, turning fast enough to see him collapse against the doorframe, blood already soaking dark through his trouser leg. "You," he gasped, disbelief warring with pain across his face. "You cut me. You should have expected that," Evie said, breath ragged but steady, retrieving the fallen revolver before he could recover enough to reach for it himself. "I've never once been the sort of woman who waits quietly to be saved." Gunfire outside had begun to taper off. The last of Sterling's deputies either fled or fallen, and moments later, Gideon's heavy footsteps sounded on the porch, rifle still raised, sweeping the room fast until his eyes landed on Evie, whole and standing, Sterling bleeding at her feet. Evie, relief broke plain across his face, quickly replaced by fierce approval as he took in the scene fully. "You're hurt." "Not mine," she said, gesturing to the blood soaking her sleeve. "All of it Sterling's." "I'm fine." Elias appeared moments later, limping slightly, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him further after the exertion of battle, but alive and steady, and looking at her with an expression that mixed relief and pride in equal measure. "Remind me," he said, breath still short, "never to underestimate a woman carrying a paring knife, despite everything, despite the blood and the exhaustion and the lingering tremor still working through her hands." Evie found herself almost laughing at that. Sterling groaned from where he'd slumped against the doorframe, clutching his bleeding thigh, his earlier fury replaced now with something closer to defeat. "You've lost," he managed. "Whatever you do to me now, more will come. My employers won't stop hunting you." "Perhaps," Evie said, kneeling just close enough to look him level in the eye, her voice cold and controlled despite everything her body had just endured. "But that's a conversation for daylight. Once you've stopped bleeding all over this floor." She looked to Gideon and Elias, both watching her now with quiet trust, waiting to see how she wanted to handle the man who'd hunted her across half a country. "Bind his leg," she said finally. "We're not murderers, whatever he might think of us, but we are done running." Gideon moved to comply, tearing a strip of cloth for a makeshift tourniquet. efficient and unbothered despite the man he was tending, having tried to kill the woman he loved only minutes before. Outside, the gunfire had finally gone silent entirely, the mountain settling back into an uneasy quiet, snow already beginning to cover the evidence of the fight that had just torn through it. Evie stood in the doorway a long moment, looking out over the battlefield her home had briefly become, and felt something settle inside her that had nothing to do with fear at all. She had survived. They all had survived. And now, finally, it was time to end this the way she'd always known she eventually would, not with more violence, but with the same sharp, careful strategy that had carried her out of New York in the first place. They kept Sterling through the day, tending his wound enough to ensure he wouldn't bleed out, though none of them offered him more comfort than strict necessity required. By afternoon, with the last of the gunfire's adrenaline finally drained from her system, Evie sat across from him at the small kitchen table, the wax-wrapped ledger resting deliberately between them. Gideon stood near the door, rifle within easy reach. Elias sat nearby, his wounded shoulder freshly rebandaged, watching Sterling with the careful attention of a man who'd trust nothing this detective said. "Without proof to back it, you could have killed me back there," Sterling said, testing the waters, his voice carrying less confidence now than it had the day before. "Would have been easier, cleaner. Would have made outlaws of all three of us," Evie said, unwrapping the ledger's protective covering, revealing the dense pages of names and numbers within. "And that's not the ending I came 2,000 miles to write for myself." Sterling's eyes flicked to the ledger, calculation returning despite his pain. "That's the proof. Then the thing you've been protecting." Idizzy met his gaze steady, unflinching. Every ounce of the union organizer she'd once been rising fully to the surface now. "And here's precisely how this concludes. Detective Sterling, you're going to listen carefully, because I've no patience left to repeat myself." She laid the terms out plain and unhurried, the same careful negotiation skill she'd honed over years, facing down factory owners far more powerful than one wounded Pinkerton. "Kill me, and copies of this ledger reach the New York presses by week's end. I've arranged as much already. Insurance against exactly this outcome. Your employer rots in prison for what happened outside that mill, and every dollar of your bounty turns to worthless paper the moment his empire collapses." Sterling's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Listening," Evie continued. "You ride back down this mountain. Report me dead, buried somewhere convenient in these hills. Collect whatever bounty your employer still owes you, and leave the three of us in peace. We keep this ledger regardless. As permanent insurance, should anyone else come hunting, you get your payment. Your employer gets his silence, for now, and I get my life back, free of your presence, and anyone else he might send after." "And if I refuse both?" Sterling asked, though the question carried more curiosity than genuine defiance. "Then you leave this cabin with nothing, wounded and empty-handed, to explain to your employer exactly how a woman and two mountain men bested you and your entire posse." Evie's voice never wavered. "I imagine that particular failure carries its own consequences in your line of work." Sterling studied her for a long moment, something like grudging respect, finally breaking through his earlier bravado. "You'd have made a formidable negotiator in any boardroom in this country," he said finally. "Shame you were born a woman. Might have run one of those factories yourself, given half a chance." "I don't need to run a factory," Evie said. "I only need men like you to stop believing you're entitled to run over women like me. Do we have an agreement?" "Detective." Sterling was quiet another long moment, weighing pride against practicality, before finally nodding once, sharp and final. "We have an agreement." They saw him off the following morning, his leg bound tight enough to manage the ride, his remaining horse retrieved from where his scattered posse had left it tied near the tree line. He said little as he mounted, though he paused once, looking back at the cabin, at the three of them standing together on the porch. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope this arrangement of yours holds. Strange a thing as it is." "It'll hold," Gideon said. arm settling easy around Evie's shoulders, longer than anything either of us knew before it. Sterling said nothing further, simply turned his horse, and rode off down the mountain, disappearing eventually into the tree line, carrying with him whatever story he intended to report back to the men who'd sent him. Spring arrived slow over the following months, snow retreating in patches, until the mountain finally revealed the green underneath it had been hiding all winter. Elias's shoulder healed clean, the wound leaving behind only a thin scar to match the others already marking both men's histories. Goliath recovered fully as well, his limp fading within weeks, his loyalty to all three of them only deepening with whatever memory he retained of the fight that had nearly cost him his life defending their porch. The bounty on Evie's head quietly dissolved, exactly as Sterling had promised. Word filtering back, eventually through careful channels, that a body matching her description had been reported, found, and buried in the Montana wilderness. Whether Sterling's employer believed the report fully, or simply chose the cheaper path of accepting it, none of them ever learned for certain. But no further Pinkertons came riding up that mountain, and eventually the fear of it stopped riding constant in the back of Evie's mind as well, with the money the three of them had saved through years of careful fur trapping, and Evie's own considerable skill negotiating terms. Most men twice her experience would have struggled to secure. They opened a small, independent lumber mill at the base of the mountain by early summer. It looked nothing like the mills Evie had once organized against back east. There were no locked exits, no unguarded machinery, no foreman paid to look away when injuries went unreported. Evie herself walked the floor most days, enforcing fair wages and safe conditions with the same fierce determination she'd once poured into strikes and picket lines. Only now, with the authority to make those changes stick, rather than simply demand them. She hired without regard to the prejudices that had cost Elias so much throughout his life, and word of that fairness spread quiet through the valley, drawing workers who'd been turned away elsewhere for reasons that had nothing to do with their competence and everything to do with small-minded fear. On a warm evening near the end of that first summer, the three of them sat together on the cabin porch. Goliath sprawled contentedly at their feet, watching the sun sink slow behind the mountains that had once seemed so foreign and threatening to Evie, and now felt simply, entirely like home. "Strange, isn't it?" Elias said, watching the light fade gold across the valley. "How far a person can travel, only to find exactly where they belonged, waiting the whole while." "Strange," Evie agreed, leaning comfortable against his good shoulder, Gideon's hand finding hers on her other side. "Though I wouldn't trade a single mile of that journey now, hard as it was. Wouldn't trade the ending either," Gideon said, quiet and certain, watching the last light fade over the ridgeline. Evie thought of Callahan then, and the mill girls back east, and all the reasons she'd once believed love and safety were luxuries reserved for women less complicated than herself. She thought of the ledger, still tucked safe in its hiding place, less a weapon now than a reminder of exactly how far compassion could carry a person, given enough courage to fight for it properly. Compassion and respect, and the stubborn refusal to accept cruelty as simply the way of things. That was the lesson this mountain had taught her, more thoroughly than any strike or picket line back east ever had. It wasn't brute strength that had carried the three of them through everything they'd faced. It was patience. It was fairness, extended even to those the world had taught to expect none. It was the willingness to stand plain and unflinching against injustice, whether it wore the face of a bigoted shopkeeper, or a corrupt detective, or a factory owner, grown fat on other people's suffering. The sun finally dipped below the last ridge, the sky deepening toward the soft blue of early evening, and Evie sat between the two men who had shown her, patiently and without condition, exactly what real partnership looked like. They were free now, all three of them, in ways that reached far beyond simply surviving Sterling's siege or escaping New York's corruption. Free to build something fair in a world that rarely offered fairness easily. free to love without hiding, without apology, without the constant fear that had once shadowed every mile of Evie's long journey west. And on that porch, in the gathering dusk, with Goliath's steady breathing and the mountain settling quiet around them, that freedom felt, finally entirely whole. In the end, Evie Reed's journey was never only about escaping New York, hiding a dangerous ledger, or surviving the men who came to silence her. It was about something much deeper, the courage to stop running from fear and finally stand in the truth. Evie began as a woman hunted by powerful men, carrying proof of cruelty stitched into a wedding dress, believing survival meant staying alone, staying guarded, and never trusting anyone too much. But the mountains of Montana taught her that strength does not always look like a raised gun or a hardened heart. Sometimes strength looks like accepting help after years of having none. Sometimes it looks like speaking up in a mercantile when everyone else stays silent. Sometimes it looks like tending a wounded man by firelight or choosing mercy, even when revenge would be easier. This story reminds us that real family is not always the one we are born into. Sometimes family is found in the people who stand beside us when the world turns its back. Gideon and Elias did not save Evie by taking away her power. They saved her by respecting it. They protected her without trying to own her. They loved her without trying to silence her. And because of that, Evie discovered that safety is not the absence of danger. Safety is the presence of people who will face danger with you. The lesson this story leaves behind is clear. Truth is worth protecting, even when it costs everything. Evie could have destroyed the ledger, vanished into the wilderness, and lived quietly with her fear. But she knew that silence would only protect the guilty. Her courage came from remembering the factory girls, the workers, the forgotten people whose suffering had been buried by rich men and corrupt lawmen. By refusing to surrender the truth, she became more than a runaway bride. She became a voice for those who had been denied one. The story also teaches that kindness is not weakness. Gideon was scarred by war, Elias by prejudice, and Evie by betrayal and injustice. Each of them carried wounds that could have made them bitter. Instead, they chose patience, loyalty, and compassion. They built a home not out of perfect lives, but out of broken pieces handled with care. That is one of the most powerful messages of all. People do not need to be unbroken to be worthy of love. Sometimes the deepest love comes from those who understand pain and choose not to pass it on. And perhaps the greatest meaning of Evie's story is that no one should have to earn dignity. Not a woman, not a worker, not a man judged by his blood or background, not anyone pushed aside by a cruel world. Dignity belongs to every person, and justice begins the moment someone is brave enough to say, "This is wrong, and I will not look away." So when Evie finally stopped running, she did not just save herself. She helped build something better, a home, a partnership, a fair mill, and a life where compassion was stronger than fear. Her story tells us that even after loss, even after violence, even after betrayal, a person can still begin again. And sometimes, the road that looks like an escape becomes the road that leads us home. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.